Alrighty, so we're going to be picking up in Matthew chapter 12 this morning. And we finished chapter 11 last week with Christ talking about the sinful nature of the Jewish cities of the region because they would not accept him coming as the Messiah, and how they're going to be judged more harshly because of this. And we can kind of apply that to ourselves, of like when we're allowed the knowledge and the opportunity to study his word, and then we walk away from it, we're judged more harshly than someone that never has that opportunity. He then explains that God the Father is being revealed to the people through him. He's in the flesh. This is God in the flesh dwelling among them. And he finishes chapter 11 by reminding us that he's gentle, he's merciful, and if we take up his yoke, meaning that we're going to walk with him, that our burden will be light. The ultimate strength and peace of mind comes from our relationship with Christ. So that's where we've kind of left off and where we're picking up starting here in chapter 12. So Matthew chapter 12, verse 1. At that time, Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were hungred. They were hungry. They'd been traveling. And they began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat. So they're walking by these cornfields. They start plucking some to eat. Now, the Sabbath, it's called Shabbat in Hebrew, is the seventh day of the week. And this was designated as the day that God rested in Genesis. Now, Israelites were prohibited from doing any work on the Sabbath. Now, according to the law of the time, the way this worked is the edges of fields, when they planted, they left the edges unharvested so that people in need would be able to pick that grain. So them taking this grain and eating it is not what's wrong. They're not stealing from this farmer or anything like that. They actually left this for people that needed it. What we're going to see here is it's about when they're doing it. That's why they're accused of doing something wrong. Now, today, as modern Christians, we don't place so much emphasis on a certain day being the Sabbath because Christ became our Sabbath. We're going to see that later in this chapter, and we also saw some of it back in chapter 11 last week. So we're going to look back a little bit. This is chapter 11, verse 28, where Christ said, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Now, the word Sabbath literally means rest. It is the day of rest. So in chapter 11, we see Christ himself saying, I will give you rest. You don't need that specific day anymore. I am your rest. He is our Sabbath. So back to chapter 12, verse 2. But when the Pharisees saw it, the religious leaders see Jesus and the disciples eating this grain, they said unto him, Behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day. So the Pharisees considered the disciples plucking that grain to be them working. They're working on the Sabbath. That's a violation of the Sabbath law. So Jesus just showed us in the last chapter that his yoke, that burden, is light if we're walking with him. It's light, it's easy. Now what we see is the heavy burden that religious leaders will try to place on people by trying to find salvation through the law instead of through Christ. We're not saved through the law. We're saved through faith in Jesus Christ. If you're trying to find salvation in the law, that is going to be a heavy burden. And Christ says his burden is light. Now, the Jews at the time were so concerned with observing the law of Sabbath that on Thursdays, a lot of us, we studied through Daniel a couple months back. You probably remember the name Antiochus Epiphanes. He was one of the rulers with the Romans. Okay, the Jews were so caught up with observing these laws of the Sabbath that they thought it was a crime to defend themselves on the Sabbath day. Okay? Now, this specifically made me think about, Tyler, you have an acquaintance that I'm pretty sure was Jewish, correct? He wears the tassels. So you know publicly that he's a Jew, right? Okay, now if we know Jewish people are so caught up in the law that they will not defend themselves on the Sabbath, if you have nefarious plans and you want to rob him, what day are you going to do it? You're going to go to his house on the Sabbath because you know he won't defend himself. It's against the law. They won't do it. That's exactly what the Romans did. They went after the Jews on the Sabbath because they were so caught up in the law that they wouldn't defend themselves, which kind of shows that heavy burden of being so caught up in the law instead of through the faith that they were supposed to have. So chapter 12, verse 3 here. But he said unto them, this is Christ speaking, Have you not read what David did when he was hungered and they that were with him? So Jesus actually asked this question on 6 different occasions. We see him ask, have you not read? He actually ends up referring to 7 different books of the Old Testament and about 10 different verses. So he's showing through this question that he knows the scripture better than the Pharisees could ever have believed that he does. He's like, I'm not some common person that you're coming to me as a religious leader and I don't understand the scriptures just as well as you do. And what he's referring to here is when David was on the run from King Saul, and he actually ate the sacred bread with permission from Ahimelech at the time, who was the priest. And that would have been a violation of the law. No one except the priests were allowed to eat the showbread, and they allowed David and his men to do so. So I want to take a look at those verses. This is 1 Samuel chapter 21, verse 1. It says, Then came David to Nob to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech was afraid at the meeting of David, and said unto him, Why art thou alone, and no man with thee? So David comes to Nob, this town, which was a priestly compound between Gibeah and Jerusalem. Now, Ahimelech immediately knows something's not right. Something's not normal with David's visit. And his line of questioning here is because he's afraid that Saul will punish him if he helps David. And we'll see that this isn't just David, but it's also his followers. So this is why Christ uses this as an example. It's David and his followers, just like we're seeing Christ and the disciples. So verse 2 there in 1 Samuel 21. And David said unto Ahimelech the priest, The king hath commanded me a business, and hath said unto me, Let no man know anything of the business whereabout I send thee, and what I have commanded thee, and have appointed my servants to such and such a place. So now when David says here that he was commanded by the king, he's lying. He's lying to Ahimelech here. He was not commanded by Saul to go and do anything. And this will actually end up causing the death of a lot of people. There's going to be conflict over these things, and we'll actually see that when we study 1 Samuel and get to chapter 20. So he tells Ahimelech that he's sent his servants away. He's going to come just himself, trying to convince Ahimelech that everything's okay. Like, hey, Saul's fine. There's no problems. You can help me out. Now, verse 3 there. Now, therefore, what is under thine hand, give me 5 loaves of bread in mine hand, or what there is present. So he's asking Ahimelech, what supplies do you have available for me? He's asking for supplies like food. That's why I asked for 5 loaves of bread, whatever Ahimelech can spare. Now, verse 4. And the priest answered David and said, There is no common bread under mine hand, but there is hallowed bread, the holy bread, the showbread. If the young men have kept themselves at least from women. Now the hallowed bread, again meaning holy bread, the bread of presence, the showbread. We see this in Exodus chapter 25. And Ahimelech says that the men must have abstained from sexual relations with women for at least 3 days. We see this in Exodus chapter 19. That's where it lays out the timing of the 3 days. So they had to have abstained for at least 3 days to be able to eat the bread, because to eat the holy bread, you have to be ceremonially clean. So they had to be ceremonially clean to even approach the showbread to eat it. So verse 5 there. And David answered the priest and said unto him, Of a truth, women have been kept from us about these 3 days since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in a manner common, yea, though it were sanctified this day in the vessel. Now, if we see in that verse there where it says the vessels of the young men, that's a euphemism for genitalia. That's what he's talking about there. The vessels of the young men have been kept clean because they've abstained. So they've abstained for at least those required 3 days. In verse 6, So the priest gave him hallowed bread, that holy bread. For there was no bread there but the showbread that was taken from before the Lord, to put hot bread in the day when it was taken away. So normally, priests would be the only ones allowed to have eaten this bread. But here we see that David's been given permission to do so. So that's actually what we see Christ referring to back in Matthew chapter 12, verse 3. That's what he was saying there. But he said unto them, Have ye not read what David did when he was an hungred, and they that were with him? So verse 4. How he entered into the house of God, and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priest. So when it says the house of God, it's referring to the tabernacle, what we just saw happen in 1 Samuel. Verse 5, Or have ye not read in the law, how on the Sabbath day the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? So what Christ is saying here is that the priests have to work on the Sabbath, which would have technically violated the law. You're not supposed to work on the Sabbath, but that's the day that priests work. And not only do they work on the Sabbath, there was more work to be done and more sacrifices done on the Sabbath than any other day of the week. That's the day they work the hardest. So it was the busiest day of the week for the priest. And it'd be easy, Bob and I actually discussed this morning, that to just think, well, Christ is allowed to do these things because he's Lord of the Sabbath. He's Lord over all things. He wrote the law, right? Don't forget, Jesus is the high priest after the order of Melchizedek. If the priests are allowed to work on Sabbath, Christ is a priest. He is the ultimate priest. And then his disciples are helping him to spread his ministry. So technically, they are all working for the church in official capacities. Not only do they need an exemption like what David got, they are working just like the priests would have been. So they are allowed to work and do what they need to on the Sabbath. So verse 6, "But I say unto you that in this place that is one greater than the temple." So Jesus is pointing out here that the Pharisees are so concerned with temple law that they fail to realize that the kingdom of heaven, God in the flesh, is standing right in front of them. And this is Jesus making a direct claim to deity. This is one of the first times we see him actually referencing, I am God. I am higher than the temple that you think of. I am everything. And of course, if the disciples had broken the law, he would know. He wrote the law. He is the judge. So even though we know he's the priest, they're allowed to do these things, that wouldn't matter. He's the one that's over the law. So verse 7, "But if you had known what this meaneth, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless." So we always say there's a big word there. Notice that Christ says, if you had known what this means. They don't know the meaning of this verse. And this is the second time here in the book of Matthew that we see Jesus quote Hosea chapter 6, verse 6. So I want to bring up that verse. He's directly quoting this. God speaking, "For I desired mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings." So Jesus is pointing out the Pharisees have missed the point. They don't understand the actual meaning of this verse. That God would come in the flesh to fulfill the law and to pave our path to salvation. None are saved by the law. No one. We cannot fulfill the law to the perfection it requires to be saved that way. And what they're doing is they're lifting up the law, the principles of sacrifice, above the principles of mercy. And God desires the opposite. He tells us here, I desire mercy, not the sacrifice. And it's easy to read that verse and we think just about sacrifice, going and making a blood offering at the temple. He's referring to the law. I desire you to follow Jesus Christ, have mercy, love, and patience, and to study in the Word more than I want you to follow the laws and the ceremonies. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to follow the law, but that's not the way we find salvation. So Matthew chapter 12, verse 8. "For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day." So again, this is Christ telling us that he is Sabbath. He is the rest. He's Lord over it. He is the Lord over all of these laws. No one can tell Christ, oh, you're breaking a law. Look what you and the disciples are doing, when he is the final judge on these things. And he's taking ownership of the Sabbath here. Now, E.W. Bollinger notes in the Companion Bible that the word even that we see here is not in the text. So remove that. No manuscript actually has that word even. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath day. We don't need to say even of this. No, he is just Lord of the Sabbath day. He fulfills the law. He is that ultimate fulfillment and becomes a Sabbath through his sacrifice on the cross. So as we study the life of Christ, remember, we're going to see him following these laws. He's going to go and do the ceremonial things like all Jews were prescribed to do. That's because he was perfect in the flesh. He followed the law better than any of us could, and he did not fulfill it until his death on the cross. At this time, he has not fulfilled the law yet. He's got to get to that point of crucifixion before that comes. And he's trying to get the Pharisees to understand that the law is beholden to God, not the other way around. The law answers to God. God does not answer to the law. And we actually see this in Colossians, so I want to go there for a moment. This is Colossians chapter 2, verse 14. "Blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out the way, nailing it to his cross." Christ blotting out the ordinances, the law, those things being done away with because it was contrary to us, meaning we could not be saved through it. And how did he do it? Nailing it to his cross. Verse 15, "And having spoiled principalities and powers, he made a show of them openly, triumphing over them in it. Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of an holy day or of the new moon, or of the Sabbath days. Christ fulfilled these things. Do not let a man judge you based off of what day you take rest and you study. And look what he says here. Don't let them judge you in the meat that you eat, in the drinks that you drink, in the holidays that you celebrate, the way that you take care of the different seasons, that's what the new moon's referring to, or of the Sabbath days. Everything is through Christ. So, yes, we know that Christ was not born on December 25th. But don't let someone judge you because you want to celebrate Christmas. As long as you are doing the things that is required in your faith of following Christ, that's the important part. He's doing away with all of that law and ceremony that they would have followed here. And then verse 17, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is of Christ. All of those things were just a shadow. Christ is the real thing. So, again, that is Paul laying out Christ becoming the fulfillment of the laws, the holidays, the traditions that these Pharisees are so caught up in. And if plucking and eating a few grains of corn from that field were enough to offend the Pharisees and the interpretations of the law that they were trying to live by, what we're about to see Christ do towards the end of this chapter is going to push them over the edge. They're so offended by eating a little bit of corn. Watch what we're going to see Christ doing now. So verse 9, this is back in Matthew chapter 12, verse 9. And when he was departed thence, he went into their synagogue. So we see Jesus entering into a synagogue. This is probably belonging to the inhabitants of Tiberias. We'll actually see this when we get to Mark chapter 3 around verse 6. It shows the Pharisees conferring with what's called the Herodians. It's in Herod's jurisdiction. So this is a place of teaching and learning the scriptures for those that couldn't make the journey to the temple in Jerusalem. Because that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to go to the temple in Jerusalem. But if you're not able to, now we have these synagogues, right? Now, think about the courage and the boldness that Christ has to have here. The Pharisees are pointing out that he's breaking the law every time they can. They keep trying to point out, oh no, he's blaspheming. He is a terrible person. And instead of like, okay, well, I'm going to go over here and teach, he goes directly into the synagogues. He goes into their places of worship and says, hey, I'm going to come here to teach these things. So he's doing this even in the face of that growing opposition against the Pharisees plotting his destruction, which we're going to see in just a moment in this chapter. That's what they want to do. He continues to go to the synagogue. He continues to follow the things he's supposed to do, setting an example for us. He's an example of being steadfast in our faith, even when we're facing pushback and conflict. Things are going to try to push us away from our faith and our belief. That's when we have to follow these examples of being steadfast and not moving away from it. And that's the ultimate example for what we're going to face in the end times in the tribulation. It says that those that are still alive in the flesh, that are followers of Christ, will be delivered up to Satan to give testimony. The ultimate confrontation that we could ever face. And we have to be ready and willing to face that. So Christ setting an example here, walking right into the den of these religious leaders that he knows are going to be the ultimate reason he ends up being destroyed, and still fulfilling the mission that he's there for. Now verse 10, and behold, there was a man which had his hand withered, and they asked him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days, that they might accuse him? So the Pharisees are trying to set Jesus up. They know that there are gossip and rumors going around about him healing people, and they're trying to convince him to heal this man, which would be a violation of the law of the Sabbath. So they're trying to set him up in the synagogue in front of people to break the law. And this is going to end up being the first of 7 miracles we're going to see Christ work on the Sabbath. This isn't even the only time he does this. He's going to do it multiple times. So verse 11, and he said unto them, what man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep, and if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? So during this time, going back to the Hebrewisms and what the Jews would have taught here, rabbis taught that in a time of life or death circumstances, that it was okay to violate the law of the Sabbath. It was okay to work. It's life or death. And Christ is referencing that fact. This would have been something that would have been considered life or death. You need to take care of this even if it's on the Sabbath. Now, remember, as we look at these verses too, that sheep are symbolic for the Christian people, and Christ is the shepherd. So he's also referencing here, I'm allowed to save one of my people on the Sabbath. That's not going to be a violation. But looking at it literally is what he does here in verse 12. Look at what he says. How much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore is it lawful to do well on the Sabbath days? So if we're allowed to save a sheep, because that's considered life or death on the Sabbath, why would we not be willing to heal a man on the Sabbath? A man is worth so much more than a sheep, right? And then right there where he says that, basically he's saying that we need to remember that Jews are permitted to care for the animals. Men are so much more than an animal to God, right? But then where he says that it is lawful to do well, that phrase means to do good deeds. So he's saying it is lawful to do good deeds on the Sabbath. If you're trying to do something to better off one of your brothers or sisters, it is lawful to do so on the Sabbath. That's kind of the extent of what he's trying to get across there. In verse 13, then saith he to the man, stretch forth thine hand. And he stretched it forth, and it was restored whole, like as the other. Now there's something that we need to notice in what's occurred here. Christ never touches the man. He never lays a hand on him. He heals him, but just by the command of his voice. Technically, Christ never did any physical work. He again has outsmarted the Pharisees at their own game. He has not done any physical work. Even though he's allowed to. He is the high priest. He is the Lord over the Sabbath. He still hasn't violated the Sabbath law. He is allowed to do exactly what he's doing, even under the law. And this gives the Pharisees no reason to accuse him of violating the law. He's circumvented what they're trying to do. But look at verse 14. It doesn't matter. Then the Pharisees went out and held a council against him, how they might destroy him. So this is the first time we see the Pharisees' true intentions. They see a miracle in front of their very eyes, and instead of rejoicing and seeing the truth and thinking, maybe this is the Messiah standing right in front of us, they are full of self-righteous anger. And whether that's from jealousy or an overzealousness with the law or something else, they let it blind them to what's happening in front of them, and now they're determined to destroy Jesus. They want Jesus dealt with and out of the picture. Verse 15. But when Jesus knew it, he withdrew himself from thence, and great multitudes followed him, and he healed them all. And he charged them that they should not make him known. Now, Jesus here asked his followers to remain silent. He asked them not to spread the words of his deeds any further. And of course, this is important because the Pharisees want to destroy him at this moment. But I want us to also understand that Jesus is not afraid. He's not afraid of the Pharisees. And in verse 15, where it says that he withdrew, he is not running from the Pharisees either. He is making sure that God's plan comes to light at the appointed time and not a moment sooner. Things are happening in the way they're supposed to. And remember, God is long-suffering. He's patient. And Jesus is God in the flesh, and he's showing his patience here. At any point, Christ could have taken care of the Pharisees. He could have snapped his fingers and had an army of angels with him. He could have done away with any of this. But the plan had to unfold the way that it was supposed to. And so he's showing patience here that it has to happen on the timeline that he had prescribed. Now, starting with verse 18, 17 he's going to lay it out. 18 is where it will start. We're going to see Jesus directly quoting a prophecy from Isaiah about the suffering servant. Now, this is another example of Jesus' fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecy. Zach and I go over this all the time. We see Old Testament prophecy being fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And this is just another example of that. So verse 17. So this is Jesus speaking. He's saying, I'm going to withdraw. Don't spread word about what I'm doing. That's what he tells the followers. And then he says, this is why. That it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, and Isaiah there meaning Isaiah. Verse 18. Behold my servant, whom I have chosen, my beloved, in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he shall show judgment to the Gentiles. Now, remember that we heard that phrase, in whom my soul was well pleased, spoken by our Heavenly Father, by God, during Jesus' baptism back in chapter 3, verse 17. And we're going to see that phrase again when we get to chapter 17. Verse 19. He shall not strive nor cry, neither shall any man hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed shall he not break, and smoking flax shall he not quench, till he send forth judgment unto victory. So this verse is laying out the gentle nature of Christ. So a bruised reed is very, very fragile. And he's saying that he's so gentle that even if it's a bruised reed, he won't break it. And a smoking flax, that means the wick of an oil lamp. So if it's not burning correctly, it ends up just smoking, and it has to be trimmed. And it's hard to trim the wick of an oil lamp. I don't know how many of you have ever dealt with an oil lamp. I've dealt with them because of you and Granny having some when I was little. But it's almost impossible to trim it without putting out the flame. And he's saying that he's even able to trim that wick without extinguishing the fire. That's how gentle he is. And he's referring to how he reforms his broken sheep, how he fixes us. He's gentle with us and fixes us without breaking who we are. Now, verse 21, and in his name shall the Gentiles trust. Now, this phrase, for him to speak this in a synagogue, would have been super offensive at the time. Because you have a Jewish man standing in a Jewish synagogue saying that we're going to come to teach the Gentiles, the heathens. Okay? Christ is saying that the Messiah is coming not just for the Jews, but for everyone, including the Gentiles. But the crazy thing about this is he's not saying something that the people shouldn't have already known. Bringing salvation to the entire world, including the Gentiles, was part of the messianic prophecies that we're going to see in Isaiah. So I want to go to the verses he quotes here in Isaiah to show that this is not new. They should have known the Messiah is not just coming from the Jews. He's coming for everyone. So this is Isaiah chapter 42, verse 1. Behold my servant, whom I uphold, mine elect, in whom my soul delighteth. I have put my spirit upon him. He shall bring forth judgment to the Gentiles. The servant here being chosen, and this is directly referring to the Messiah, to Jesus Christ. And we see the servant receiving the Spirit of God, right? I have put my spirit upon him. That, again, directly referencing his baptism. Isaiah 42, verse 2 here. He shall not cry, nor lift up, nor cause his voice to be heard in the street. So the Messiah will come quietly, not drawing attention to himself. Now think about what we just saw in verse 16. He's asking his followers not to spread his word, right? Don't go out and tell everyone what I'm doing. Now verse 3. A bruised reed shall he not break, and smoking flax shall he not quench. He shall bring forth judgment unto truth. So again, exactly what we saw in Matthew. The bruised reed referring to those that are already beaten down and weakened, the sinners. And then Christ coming to salvation for all those that will follow him. And we also have to look at when he says that he's not going to break us, this is also talking about judgment and the end times, that there's no judgment now for those that have died now, and in 6 months, the people that die then, it's all at one time. And in verse 4, he shall not fail nor be discouraged till we have set up judgment in the earth, and the isle shall wait for his law. So the Messiah's reign, the millennial reign, is to help establish perfect justice. All things lead up to judgment and the beginning of the eternity, including the tribulation, the millennial reign. All things lead to this. And so we see Jesus directly quoting Old Testament scripture to show that the Pharisees are missing the meaning behind the verses, that they're blind to the fact that the Messiah is standing right in front of them. They've gotten so caught up in the law and enforcing it that they've missed the most important lessons that the scriptures are trying to teach. And notice that it says, his law. The law belongs to God, the judge that presides over the law. And they're so wrapped up in the law that they don't even see that the judge, the owner of the law, is right there in front of them. And I want us to think, though, about how easy it would be to point a finger at the Pharisees. How easy it is to read these verses and think, how blind could they have been? How could they have missed this right in front of them? But how easy is it for us to fall into that same trap? How easy is it for us to get so concerned over theological debates, over dissecting the Bible and looking at this verse and what does this verse mean and break down what that word says, that we start to forget the most important part? I know I do it. I certainly do it myself all the time. I get caught up in breaking down the statue in Daniel that we studied, right? Well, what does this part mean, and what country did that represent, and what was the timeline of how this all goes together, that I forget to focus on the rock. It wasn't about the statue. It's about the rock that crushes the statue. And that rock was Jesus Christ. every word, every verse, every chapter, every book of the Bible point to one thing and one thing only, and that's Jesus. Blessings, mercy, grace, salvation, they all go through him. It's all about Jesus. The Father sent his Son to give us all of those things. And we need to always keep our eyes focused on Jesus Christ. When we're studying, we need to have it through the lens of Jesus. That's God in the flesh, paying the price for our sins. And he was given a name above all others that every tongue will confess. And we see that explicitly laid out in Philippians. So I want us to look at those verses. Philippians chapter 2. This is verses 9, 10, and 11. Wherefore God also hath highly exalted him, and given him a name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, of things in heaven, and things in earth, and things under the earth, and that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father.